Hi everybody, welcome to ExamRevision's Ordinary Level Maths Leaving Cert Tips and Predictions video 2025. So just to begin with, a reminder of the adjustments for 2025. Hopefully you guys are familiar with this from your mock exams. So each paper 1 and paper 2, is going to be split into two sections, section A and section B. Both sections are worth 150 marks each, so each paper will add 300 marks. And what you guys need to remember is that in each section you will do one less question than the questions available. So in section A, you're going to have 6 questions available and you have to do 5 of them. And then similarly in section B, there will be 4 questions and you have to do 3 of them. So it's really important, obviously, when you're going into the exam, that you give yourself the first 5 to 10 minutes to have a quick look through your paper and to decide which questions you're going to be focusing on in section A and which one you're going to be focusing on in section B. So, again, we'll go through timings and things in a couple of minutes, but just when you're going into section A, I suppose you're thinking, right, I have to leave out one of these questions, and each of the questions that I complete will be worth 30 marks. So that will be 30 times 5, which will give me my 150. And then similarly in section B, you're going to be doing 3 50-mark questions, which will add to our 150 marks. So a couple of tips for your exams just to be aware of and to remind you about. Do make sure you're reading all of your questions carefully to make sure you know exactly what you're being asked to do. Is it a factorizing, a solving, a simplifying question? Just those little starter words can really help focus what you're being asked to do in a question. As always, remember the importance of attempt marks. So, remember that even if you're not 100% sure of how to get a final answer in a question, that you can pick up loads of attempt marks if you show you're working and are kind of going in the right direction. So do make sure to show everything, including calculations that you're putting into your calculator. Don't assume later questions have most marks. A lot of the times you'll actually notice that earlier questions have more marks. So, just because you can't do the last part of a question doesn't mean that you can't have, a lot of marks already added up in that question. So in regards to timing for your 2 papers then, we would generally recommend you spend about 15 minutes on each of your section A questions, maybe a little bit longer if needed, like up to 17 minutes, but around 15 minutes is a good ballpark figure to be aiming for. And then for your section B questions, 20 to 22 minutes per question. And again, if you stick to roughly those timings, you'll have 5 to 10 minutes at the start to read through your questions, which I think is really important since you do have a bit of choice. And then you should have another, 10 to 15 minutes at the end where you might ultimately decide to maybe do another section A question, or you might just use that time to tidy up a question that maybe you found a bit tricky or that you didn't have time to complete. Also, I would definitely recommend that you track your time spent per question. So try not to get caught up in, the space where you're spending, 30 minutes on a section A and then you're going to be under pressure. So do track it and try and keep to, those timings where possible. And remember, mark it and you can return to it later on when you've got your extra 10 minutes at the end, but just don't try and spend all your time on one question and then you'll be really under pressure towards the end of the exam. If you use your calculator, still show your calculations on the page. Don't forget to use your formula table. So remember, there's loads of useful formulae in there. So do keep it, in mind when you're going through the paper, because you never know what quick sight of something in your formula tables might jog your memory. Draw sketches to help you visualize questions. Particularly I find on paper 2, it can be really handy with some of the line or circle or area and volume questions. Be really careful of your minus signs in questions. They can, as you know, catch you out where, a minus by a minus gives you a plus. So do always be very careful with those, and also make sure you're putting them into your calculator properly. So if you're ever, substituting in a number, always put it into a bracket, and that will make sure that your calculator is correctly evaluating the minus signs. Try and do a common sense check with your answers where possible at the end to see does it make sense in the context of the question, and make sure that you have implemented the correct degree of accuracy. So that means make sure you've rounded it correctly, or like rounded it to a certain amount of decimal places or significant figures, and that you're including your units each time as well. whether that's centimeters, meters, whatever. And again, sometimes that won't be relevant, but in the questions that it is, make sure you are including them. So these are your topics that generally come up on paper 1 and paper 2 that you need to be aware of. But as I say up here, it is possible that some elements of the course may come up on either paper. So sometimes in paper 1 you might see a bit of an area and volume or a Pythagoras' theorem question, even though we would normally say that it would tend to come up on paper 2. So don't be shocked or surprised if something comes up that you thought would come up on paper 2 and vice versa, because that absolutely does happen most years. So this is more of a general guide, but you should be ready for any question really on either paper. And if I suppose you notice that something hasn't come up on paper 1, it might be something that might come up on paper 2. So not to just discount all the paper 1 topics either. So here we have hopefully a useful overview for you guys when you're getting ready to complete your paper 1 exam and you're doing some revision over the coming weeks. This is basically just an overview of all the different questions that have come up for between 2024 to 2018, and it just gives you a good view of the types of questions that keep coming up every year and making sure that you know those inside out. So like if we look here, you can see almost every year over the last number of years, question 1 has been arithmetic. Now look, obviously if it gets changed like it did in 2022 from question 1 to 3, it makes no difference, but it's just more from a visual perspective. When you open up your paper, there's a very, very, very high chance that in section A, which remember is question 1 to 6, you are going to see at least one, if not more, arithmetic questions. So that's your money questions, your financial maths, your income tax, your percentages, your markup, your margin, compound interest, all those different things. It's generally a very nice question. So that would be an absolute must in my eyes as a question that you guys need to make sure that you have prepared. The next one that is pretty much guaranteed is you're going to get a section A question on complex numbers. You can see we've had it every year going back for many, many years. So again, you need to make sure you're going back over the main topics that come up on complex numbers, like your Argand diagram, working out your modulus, being able to multiply complex numbers, divide them, things like that. So just do make sure you're looking over those section A complex numbers questions, because again, in my eyes, it's an absolute guarantee for you guys for this year. Now the next one is also very, very important, and it's one that I would be telling all of my students to make sure that they've gone back over, is you're pretty much guaranteed to get 1, if not 2, because it has come up as 2 in a few years, an algebra question. So what you can see here, I've tried to kind of mark it onto the sheet, is that most years we have some type of a simultaneous equation. So you can see in 2024 we had a linear and a non-linear simultaneous equation. 2023 we had a linear simultaneous equation. 2022 we had a linear. 2021 we had a non-linear. 2020 we had a non-linear. 2019 we had a non-linear, and 2018 we had a linear. So look, there's no like exact exact layout there that you could say, okay, this year you guys are definitely going to get a linear, because we have had a few years where you've got non-linear 3 years in a row. So look, it's 2 versions of a simultaneous equation. I would be saying it's an absolute must that you know how to do a simultaneous equation with 2 linear, and you need to be able to do a linear and a non-linear. So again, I'd be saying that without a shadow of a doubt, that's going to come up this year for you guys as well. The other stuff that seems to be very common is some type of an equation that you're being asked to solve. So again, you can see here, nearly every year we've had some type of an equation that you have to solve, whether it's just a normal linear equation where maybe you'll have to do a bit of work. You might have to multiply out brackets and then solve it, or you also might have a quadratic. So you'll notice here I've also written down on a few of them quadratic equations. Now again, there was a quadratic equation on it last year that you had to solve, but no reason why it might not come up again this year. So I would be saying make sure you know how to solve like linear equations where you're maybe just multiplying out a bracket and then solving it, bringing your x's to one side, your numbers to the other using your balance method. But also make sure you know how to solve a quadratic equation. And that's where if you're being asked to round it to a certain amount of decimal places, you'll have to use your minus b formula. I would also suggest that inequalities have a good chance of coming up for you guys this year. It is a question that does feature, relatively consistently on the exam. And I know we had one in 2023, so it could definitely be worth looking over a few inequality questions. It came up in question 3 in 2023 and 2019 as well. So yeah, I would definitely recommend having a look over inequalities and just make sure you're, familiar with the kind of standard algebra topics that you guys would have done in 5th year and obviously revised from your junior cycle as well, because it is such a popular question. The other part of algebra that does feature relatively frequently is algebraic fractions. So I would definitely recommend having a look over a couple of algebraic fractions as well. Then we're getting on to our differentiation calculus questions, and what we'll notice if we just stick with section A for a minute is that it tends to come up with functions. So a lot of you probably remember even doing these two topics together or relatively close together in school, where your teachers might have spoken about functions and calculus or functions and differentiation. So again, I would definitely recommend focusing first of all on your section A's and looking at a few of these recent years questions. If we go back to, let's say, 2018, you can see it was question 5, 2019 question 3, 2020 question 6, question 5, question 4. We had 2 of them then in 2023, and then we kind of had differentiation and functions then coming up last year as well. So definitely a very, very common question. And then a question that comes up every year but doesn't always come up as a section A is patterns. It does kind of feature either as a section A or it will come up in section B generally. So I would be saying the fact that it hasn't come up as a section A for a couple of years would mean that potentially it could come up as a full section A question for you guys this year. So make sure you're going back over your different types of patterns, you're looking at your formula tables, and you're happy that you know which formula you use for which pattern. And then if we look at the section B questions, then you could see that there is some consistency there, that over the last number of years, particularly since the COVID adjustments, where we've had a guaranteed kind of 4 questions coming up in section B, you tend to get at least one arithmetic question, which is your financial maths. You might have some other bits and bobs mixed in with it. So you can see in 2023, they had arithmetic and applied measure, even though we would generally say applied measure is a paper 2 topic. You can see how it came up there. We have a bit of functions and calculus or differentiation, which comes up at least 1, if not 2 questions, and then maybe a bit of patterns. And the other one, just to say, is that rearranging comes up, a bit as well, just where you're being asked to rearrange a formula in terms of a different letter. So just make sure you've practiced that as well, because that's a really nice question if it does come up. So in summary then, let's just look at the main topics that we know come up on paper 1. So if I was trying to, I suppose, look at my key areas that we should be focused on for paper 1, then I'd be saying arithmetic, which is your financial maths, algebra, complex numbers, functions and calculus, which is your differentiation, and patterns. So they would be the 5 kind of areas that I'd be focusing, the last minute attention on to get ready for my paper 1 topics for this year. And just before we look at some paper 2 tips, this is just a reminder that we do have the full ordinary level Leaving Cert course done out in our complete revision package on ExamRevision. So anyone that feels like they need a little bit more support in the run up to the exams, I'd highly recommend that you log on and have a look around the website www.examrevision.ie, and we do have a range of video tutorials, presentations, like H1 notes, quizzes, and exam builders as well. And you can use the code 2025 tips for 10% off a package. These are the subjects that we have available for the junior cycle course for any of you that know anyone sitting the junior cycle exams this year. And then these are the subjects that we have for the Leaving Cert course. So you can see we've got a wide range of subjects available there for Leaving Cert. So while obviously you guys are watching this video for ordinary level maths, there might be other subjects there that you're interested in. So definitely log on to the website, have a look around, and remember you can use the code 2025tips for 10% off. Here are some reviews from some of our students. So you can see that people really like using the website and it helped them to get prepared for their exams. You can see Lucy here wrote 10 out of 10 website, saved my dreams of staying in higher level maths, helped me go from a H7 to a H4, over the moon with that result. Thank you so much for your amazing videos. So I know definitely for maths in particular, students really like having videos to watch through to see a step by step. So anyone who feels like you do need a little bit of extra help, I definitely recommend logging on and having a look around and yeah, hopefully just make you feel a little bit more confident in the run up to your exams. Now moving on to paper 2, just to give you some tips and predictions for what we think is going to come up for you guys for this year. So again, let's start with section A, looking at question 1 to 6. So we can see here, starting off with the line, you can see in yellow that you're pretty much going to be guaranteed at least one section A question on the line based on the last number of years, and you're also pretty much guaranteed one circle question. So again, if you're thinking about section A, remember you have to do 5 out of the 6 questions. The line and the circle, pretty much guaranteed. They're nice ones to go in and apply your formulae, use your formula tables, and generally speaking, they're an okay question, but it is really important to take your time with them. Make sure you're using the correct formula, make sure you're using brackets when you're subbing in, you're not getting confused with any minuses and things like that. And generally speaking, they are nice questions. The next one then that we would say is very common on section A would be a statistics and probability question. Now again, depending on the year, you'll see it comes up in slightly various ways in section A, but you can see last year we had like a stats question, a probability question, and then we had a combined question. So you can see how important stats and probability was to be able to actually answer a lot of the paper. Similarly then in 2023 we had 2 stats and probability questions in section A. The year before we had 2 primarily statistics questions in section A. The year before we had a probability question, we had probability and a bit of area and volume, and we had a statistics question. And you can see that that trend is kind of consistent over the last number of years. So I would be saying that pretty much guaranteed you're going to have at least 2 section A questions on statistics or probability. So really, really important to go back over the last number of years on both of those and make sure that you're happy with how to approach them. Go back over in, let's say, probability, make sure you're happy with your different types of probabilities and, being able to apply if something is an independent event, mutually exclusive, things like that. In statistics, make sure you're going over all your different types of graphs, your mean, your mode, your median, and all those different averages that you've been working out between junior cycle and leaving cert. And also with statistics, we know you also might get things linked with your normal curve and using your empirical rule, which is very common between section A and section B, and also that you're able to do your confidence intervals and your hypothesis tests. So they're very, very common questions on the exam. The next question that we can see has been very consistent over the last number of years is a geometry question. So that's where you're going to be doing some work with shapes, with angle facts, maybe a construction. There was a construction on the exam last year, so some people may say, yeah, maybe less likely to have a construction this year. However, the only caveat to that I would say is you could see in 2019 and 2018 they did have a construction 2 years in a row. So I would certainly not be encouraging students to leave out constructions. But I suppose it's one of those ones, if you were planning to leave something out, maybe that has a slightly less chance coming up. But like I said, based on previous years, there's no reason to say that it won't come up for you guys this year as well. And then moving on to section B, then you can see again, you've got your questions 7 to 10. We have some, I suppose, consistent things here. And one thing I wanted to mention is that trigonometry appears nearly every year, at least once, if not twice, in section B. So you can almost guarantee yourself when you're doing your revision that you're going to see trigonometry in section B. However, I would also say that there is a chance you might end up getting a trigonometry question in section A, because you can see here we haven't had a trigonometry question in section A for the last 2 years. So maybe we might see a trigonometry question coming up as a section A for 2024. But I would be very confident that it will also come up as a section B. So do make sure when you're revising trigonometry, similar to statistics and probability, make sure you're looking at them as your section A questions, but also make sure you're looking at them as your section Bs, so you can see the varying ways that they're going to appear between section A and section B. Other thing to notice as well is you can see area and volume is coming up a lot in section B. It hasn't featured really heavily in section A for a couple of years as its own standalone question. But again, if we go back to 2020, 2019 and 2018, you could see that it was coming up as a full kind of standalone section A question. It came up a little bit in 2021 and a little bit in 2023. So again, I'd be saying there is a chance that you guys might see a bit of area and volume in section A as well. And, I know I've said it already, but do make sure you're studying the likes of statistics and probability as a section A and section B question, because the way that they're going to come up in those sections will be slightly different, and the length of the questions, as we know in section B, are a lot longer. So now let's just summarize with the main topics then that you guys need to make sure you're revising for paper 2. So the main topics that I'd be focusing on then will be the line, the circle, trigonometry, probability and statistics, geometry, and your length, area, and volume. So again, they're the key areas that you need to make sure that you feel confident in going into paper 2.